My name is Darrell Barton. I went to work at Channel 4 in the spring of 1969. I was working at a station in Wichita, Kansas, and I thought I was pretty hot stuff, and I had heard about WKY-TV, the newsroom down there, and it was really the place to be. Houston Hall had been there, and he was already a legend in the business, and I'd heard of Ernie Schultz, and so when I heard there was an opening there, I called one day. And what I didn't understand is that Ernie did the noon news, and I called at 5 minutes till 12. And Ernie was a little testy at that time of day, and the phone, I mean, you could just feel the ice cubes coming off the phone. And basically, I got no response from him whatsoever, so I told my wife that we're going to give up on that. And but about 2 or 3 days later, I got a call from him, and he was actually friendly to me. And so I went down there and met him, and he asked me, I'd taken a reel down, something to show him of what I'd shot. I was a cameraman. And he didn't want to see it, which kind of hurt my feelings a little bit, but he gave me a camera and he told me to shoot something in the newsroom, which I did, and he looked at it and said, okay, let's go to lunch. And we went to lunch and we talked about video. We talked about the theory of video and the theory of pictures and how they go together, and it was a wonderful conversation. But sometime right in the middle of the conversation, he says, okay, how much money do you need to come down here? And so I came up with a figure, and he said, fine, now where were we? And I thought, damn, I should have asked for more money. But now we had lunch with him. That is the longest conversation I ever had with Ernie. Normally every other conversation I've had with him has been about 3 minutes. Or that's actually a long conversation. But so I started I think it was March or April of '69, and for me, I'd only been in television for a couple of years. It was absolutely heaven. I mean, I went down there because I not only wanted to take pictures, I wanted to write. And it was a newsroom where everybody did everything, and it was required that everybody did everything. Ernie Schultz took a camera home. Jack Ogle took a camera home with him. Everybody was required to know how to shoot. Everybody was required to know how to write. Everybody was required to voice, run the film processor. I liked the writing part. I didn't mind processing the film too badly. I wasn't crazy about voicing my own stories when we did it, and so I went to Ernie one time and I said, Ernie, the writing's fine and all this, I'm really enjoying this, but if it's all the same to you, I would rather have somebody else voice my stories. I would rather not voice them. And he said, that's good, that's fine. He says, I'm sure you can find someplace they'll let you do that, but not here. When I went to work there was the group of people that were there. There was Charles Hoff. Charlie Hoff later on became the bureau chief at CNN in London and CNN in Tel Aviv. Bob Dotson came to work not too long after I got there. And then Lynn Sathenrath. Jack Ogle was the main anchor. George Tomic was doing the 10 o'clock news. All of these people had tremendous talent. And I could learn from them, and I think I did learn some things from them. Plus, it was fun. In my mind, as I think back on it, probably it wasn't as much fun then as it seemed to be later on, but at the time it just seemed like I was going to work and enjoying it every day because it was a constant learning process. Ernie had a knack of running a very tight ship and at the same time allowing quite a bit of freedom. You didn't want to really cross him. His name was the King. That was what he was known as. And you learn to avoid certain situations with Ernie, like when he wanted to fly his airplane. He had I don't remember what kind of plane it was. It was a tail dragger, which, back in there. And he flew from this airport over the Northwest Expressway, which was known as Crosswinds International, because it always had a crosswind. And when he would come in to land, it was a fearful thing. He could land fine in pastures and he could land fine in wheat fields, but airports seemed to be a little problem for him. And when he would come in and he would start looking at maps, the newsroom would just clear out because nobody wanted to be there. And it was the slow person that ended up flying with him that day. Jack Ogle was the main anchor. Jack he must have been the most laid-back anchorman that has ever lived. He never pre-read his copy, but it didn't matter because he could go up there and do it smoothly. But he told me one time that there were certain words that he did not want written in any scripts because he did not want to say them on the air. And one of those words was organism. That I just don't want that, I'm afraid I'm going to say something that won't sound like organism. So I did a story one time on bad tasting water at Lake Hefner, which they told me was caused by a tiny little organism. And so I intentionally put that word about 12 times in the script. He went up there, he'd never read it, and when he got to it, he never faltered, he never wavered, and every time he came to the word organism, he put another word in there, a critter, a little bug, a thingy. Ran through, and when he came back in the newsroom, he just looked at me and said, "Nice try." So Jack one time dropped his copy on the way down there, and he dropped it when he stopped at the restroom. And he dropped all of his copy. This was before teleprompters in the toilet, and so it was all wet. And he picked it up in there, and he went in, and he just kind of peeled it off one layer at a time while he read through it. It never fazed him. Ernie did the new news. Ernie was not quite that cool on the air. He was good on the air. And I remember when I got there, they had what they called the limbo set, which there was just black behind him. And as I understood it, Ernie had forbidden the camera people to touch a camera during the newscast. The directors were forbidden to touch any buttons on there, and because he didn't trust anybody to do that. And the anchorman and the weatherman and the sportscaster all did their thing from behind the same set. They would just swap off with each other. Ernie ran a tight ship, but sometimes, and you gotta understand, we didn't do as much news then. We had the noon news, we had 30 minutes at 6, 30 minutes at 10. And on some days, some magic days, when everybody got all of their things together, all their stories together, say by 4:15 or 4:30, Ernie would say, "Okay, everybody but one out back, touch football." And the entire newsroom, except for one poor person who had to stay in and listen to the phones, would go out and play touch football until the newscast went on. I don't think you'll find that happening at very many television stations today. When I went to work there, Jack was the old hand, and I remember he told me one day, he gave me a little bit of wisdom. He said, "Let me tell you how to get a raise." He said, "I start rumors." He said, "I'll go down to the coffee shop, and I'll say something to somebody down there." Said, "What do you know about Philadelphia? You ever been to Philadelphia?" Then later on, he'll ask somebody, said, "Real estate prices in Philadelphia aren't really that high." Or, "They actually do some pretty good television news in Philadelphia." And he said, usually 2 or 3 days after that, I get a raise. He said, "And I've never been to Philadelphia." Some of you may remember there was a rule at WKY at that time that nobody was supposed to know what anybody else made, how much money they made. That was a rule. It was hard and fast. But since probably the statute of limitations has run out on this now, sometimes late at night when I would be down there and with one other person, we would wander through Ernie and Jack's office. They shared an office. Jack was the assistant news director at this point, to see what was left out. And one time during the Christmas vacation time, when Ernie was on vacation, Jack was there, but he didn't spend a lot of time there. About 11 o'clock, I and another person discovered that there was a folder left out on Jack's desk. And this folder had everybody in the newsroom's pay scale in there. Well, that folder laid out on Jack's desk for about 4 or 5 days. And after a while, almost everybody in the newsroom was in a bad mood because they had found out what we believed, what they believed were inequities in pay. And after a while, Jack came to me and he said, "Darrell," he says, "what the hell's going on?" He says, "Everybody's pissed off." And I said, "Jack, look at your desk." And he looked at it and said, "Oh shit, oh Well, as it ended up, when Ernie got back, almost everybody got a raise. It was a wonderful thing. We were thinking about breaking into Ernie's office all the time after that. When I had worked in Kansas, in Wichita, it was during some racial disturbances up there, and I had covered those. I'd covered the riots in Kansas City at that time also. And one of the things when I came to work at Channel 4 and I talked to Ernie about was that he was interested in my experience in doing this. But I told him, I said, there's one thing that I won't do. And I will never shoot a riot before it's a riot. Because I had been involved in an incident in Kansas where I believed that I and another cameraman, because of our presence, had probably caused one. And I said, I won't do that. And that was a little, because Oklahoma City was everybody thought Oklahoma City was going to be a tinderbox for racial problems. It didn't happen. But there were times, and I remember Ernie telling me one time when I was out in the car, he said there was some things going on at Southeast High School, and I was down there in an unmarked car, and I called in and I said, there's some kids milling around, but there's nothing really happening. And he said, well, why don't you get out and let's shoot some of this? And I said, no. And you have to think a long time before you tell Ernie Schultz no, but he went along with it. One day, Ernie called a newsroom meeting, which we had every once in a while. We would do this after the new newscaster, usually right after 1 o'clock, before everybody went out on their stories. And he said, we're going to hire Pam Henry, a woman in the newsroom, which was the first woman in the newsroom. And Pam, who had polio, and she walked on crutches. And he said, of course, this is going to be a little different for us because of her situation, she's not going to be able to carry the 75-pound box full of sound gear and some other things. But, she's a talented person. And one of the people there in the newsroom, Tom Morton, Tom said, well, I'm not going to work with her. And Jack said, Tom, that's fine. You don't have to work with her. You can go right on upstairs right now, and I can call up there and we can get a check for you. Tom said, well, maybe I will. Maybe I will. Pam worked hard. She was a pioneer. The other pioneer in the newsroom, which was before that, was not too long after I came to work there, was Oliver Murray. Oliver was the first black man to work in the newsroom. Ray Summers had worked as the film processor, but Oliver was the first person to actually go out on the streets as a news person for Channel 4. And he just retired, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago. He was a great addition to the newsroom and became a good friend. Sometime in the early 70s, I don't remember exactly when, there was a situation at Langston University that had caused a large group of Langston students to come down to the state capitol and protest, and they'd kind of surrounded the capitol. I don't remember exactly what the story was, honestly, but one night the governor was going to have a news conference there about this situation. Ed Hardy, who worked in the newsroom but sometimes did some things for television, was up there, and he called in and he said, we need the governor's going to do the news conference, we need a photographer down here. There was already a camera set up there, we need a photographer. And so the photographer that they sent down there was Oliver Murray. Now, the Capitol was surrounded by this group of young black men, and Oliver knew everybody at the Capitol. He came in through what they call the tunnel there, and the trooper down there knew him. And so Oliver goes in, and he's walking across the rotunda of the Capitol on his way up to the newsroom where the governor's going to do the news conference. And a trooper who didn't know Oliver stopped him and said something like, hey boy, what the hell do you think you're doing in here? And about that time, Ed Hardy leaned over the railing upstairs and says, Oliver, hurry up, we need the film, we need to shoot. Oliver said, Ed, I'll be right up there in a second to be a photographer as soon as I get done being a nigger down here. Oliver was a feisty young man. After I was chief photographer, I, in theory, kind of hired people. I hired a young man as a weekend news photographer. His name was Buchanan. And he was always probably a 21-year-old. He was a college student. He worked part-time. And it was in the winter and working on a Saturday, and I was there. And he went to dinner. Took a news car, marked news car. And maybe 45 minutes later, after he'd gone to dinner, I got a call from Norm Bagwell. And he says, Darrell, he says, you have a news photographer out for a news car right now? And I said, yeah. He says, is he driving car number 8? And I said, yeah. He says, well, you're going to get a call from him in a little bit. He's going to tell you that his car has been stolen. And he's going to be very upset. When he does that, listen to him very carefully and then tell him to walk across the street and ring the bell on the brick house right across the street from where he is. He said, I've got his car. This young man had gone to visit a friend and had left the car running outside the house while he was inside talking to his friend. Mr. Bagwell had sat there in his living room and watched this news car at his TV station sitting there idling. And after a while, he had gone and gotten in it, drove it, put it into his garage, and closed the door. Maybe 5 minutes later, I got a call from Mr. Buchanan, almost in tears, saying I've left the car out there. I only left it for maybe a minute. And I listened to him, and after a while, I said, walk across the street, son. See what that man over there has to say. Mr. Bagwell, I think, had a very good day that day. He enjoyed it. Before I went to work at WKY, it already had the reputation of being maybe the best visual TV station in the country, visual news station in the country. And when I got there, my wife was still finishing college in Kansas, and so for the first 3 or 4 months, I was batching it down there. And at nights, they used to have a place in there back behind the newsroom called the Land of the Midgets. The Land of the Midgets was like an attic, and they called it the Land of the Midgets because you couldn't stand up in there. It was probably about 4.5 feet tall, the ceiling was, but that's where all the film was stored. And I would go through there and just pick out cans of film and take them down and look at them, because they had people shooting stories there like Houston Hall, who may be the greatest television news cameraman that ever lived. Scotty Burner, who went on to be a great NBC staff cameraman. Cliff Atkins, who was actually the guy I replaced. And I would look at their stories and just see how they worked, and how they worked. And I learned from them. It already had, like as I say, it already had a reputation there. I tried to keep up with it, and fortunately, I got a lot of support at it. Back in the 70s, when there were quotas that you needed people of different ethnic groups and different things in the newsroom, Ernie was lamenting one day, and I was with him, that he says, I've got a black person working here, I've got Oliver, I've got a female working here, I've got Pam. He said, but here I am in Oklahoma, I don't have any Indians. And I said, Ernie, how about Ron Turner? He says, what about? I said, he's a Comanche. He says, you're kidding. I said, no, he's an honest-to-God Comanche. He's on the tribal rolls. Oh my God, it was like it was Christmas for him. He had just gotten a Christmas present. Here he had his own Indian and never knew it. Probably the single most talented person I ever worked with anywhere, and particularly at WKY. Later on, whatever its other call letters were for a long time after that, was Ron Turner. Ron could do anything. He could shoot better than I could. I think he was probably a better writer in many ways than Dotson. He had a great voice. The unique thing was he did it all completely without ego. He would do it and it was so easy that it was just, you would never know that it was difficult unless you really studied it. He made it look that way. One of the new people one day told me they were just kind of confused a little bit. They'd gone out on a story out of town with Ron. They came back and said, "Does he ever talk?" And I said, yeah, I guess he does. He said, "Well, I've been with him 4 hours today, and all he ever said was turn here." You know, it's kind of, I guess it's kind of a Comanche thing. He didn't waste a lot of words. In 1971, I started really pitching hard that we should go to the Olympics in Munich, and we're going to be held there in the next year, in 1972. And finally, Ernie said okay, and he said, "Okay, it'd be you and Dotson and Barry." I was responsible for organizing the equipment. Dotson was responsible for making the travel arrangements, and Barry was responsible for getting credentials. We had some equipment problems, and we eventually had some travel problems. As far as the credentials went, apparently Barry thought that going to the Olympics was a lot like going to a Norman High School football game, that if you showed up and said you're with sports, that they will let you in. So when we got to Munich, we had no credentials of any kind. I've been to 2 Olympics, both of them for WKY, and I've never seen an event yet. But we started pulling people out. We would send messages into the Olympic Village, and we would find Oklahoma athletes to come out, and we would do interviews, we would do features, and we would do things like that. Now, our travel problem that we had is that supposedly the hotel we were going to stay at when we first got there was within relatively easy driving distance of Munich. Well, actually, it was 95 miles from Munich, and it was in a beautiful little town, but it wasn't very close. So we got ourselves a room. Well, we all 3 of us stayed in one big room in Munich. One morning we got up and we heard on the radio that the Israeli Olympic team was being held hostage, which was the big story that year. We got in our car and we drove over there. Again, we can't get in the village. We never could get in the village before. Sure as hell, we're not going to get in the village now. And we realized after we went over there, we were put way away from there, that there was no way that we could shoot any film, that we could get any pictures that would be current, because the whole world was going live on this thing. So we went back to our hotel, our room, and tried to figure what to do. And at that time, WKY also, we had a radio station. And we're talking to the newsroom back there, and as our landlord, we're watching German television, we realized that German television, the information that they're getting is about 45 minutes ahead of the information that they're getting in the States. So we set up a relay where our landlord would translate what was going on in the news. I would scribble down the story. I would write a story. I'd hand the story to Dotson. And we were doing wall-to-wall newscast on the radio from Munich. We did this for 2 days until the situation was pretty over. When it was over, Ernie said, "We don't need any more cute features from Munich. In fact, we don't need anything else from Munich to speak of. Maybe some radio things, but nothing else." So we left our room in Munich and we went out to our, what we called our country home in the Alps, where we sat out and drank beer and ate schnitzel, and Barry would call in 2 or 3 times a day and get the people in Oklahoma City to give him what information had happened at the Olympics that day, and he would read it back to him, and that's our newscast. So our last week in Munich was wonderful. Barry was not a world traveler, so he could go to a fine restaurant, and the only thing he ever wanted was a cheeseburger and fries. And so traveling with Barry it was like you never left Norman. I didn't always agree with Ernie Schultz, and as he will tell you, I've often voiced my disagreements with him, but Ernie may have been the last news director in America that based his decisions on what was the right thing to do. Not on what was the politic thing to do, not whether it was good for the ad department, the sales department, but on whether it was the right thing to do. And not many of those left over. When I left the station in '83 for what seemed to me at the time a perfectly logical reason. I was riding my motorcycle in the field out behind the station and flipped it. Motorcycle landed on my leg and it broke. The leg broke, motorcycle broke too. Went home, sat down, decided maybe I should do something else. So I called Ron Turner, who was the news director then, and said, I'm quitting, I'm going to resign, and I'm going to be a freelancer, not having a clue what freelancing was about. But again, I was very fortunate. I worked for the networks. I went to 40 different countries. I covered wars. I got shot at. I had a good time. I've worked with good people. It was a good time. I went to Afghanistan 2 or 3 times. I went to Iraq twice. I've got a picture of me standing in the hole where they caught Saddam Hussein. Of course, when the people look at the picture, the question is, who looked worse coming out of the hole, me or Saddam? But I'm done, I'm retired, I'm a farmer. It was a good time.